Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. Thand'Olwethu Dlanga, umntu ungawuye umalinge kandima, unkumbuzo umntana enkosi, bona abala ukubiza inkosi ngoba bazi inkosi ngokwazo. Once again, I welcome you into Pont the Politique on a Friday afternoon when we are talking about the last part of the virtual Bulhoek Massacre commemoration, which occurred on the 24th of May 1921. As I have said earlier, I welcome you into our platform. Pont de Politique, it's a bridge to politics. It's a French name for an English bridge to politics. If you are joining us for the first time on this platform, please make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel and ensure that you are holding the fort as we are discussing very, very nice and relevant aspects of our lives. We are also available on Twitter at Pont de Politique, Facebook, it is the same thing, Instagram, and on TikTok. Over the past few days, from Monday up until today, we had engaged the issue or the aspect of what we call Bulhoek Massacre. And yesterday we had a beautiful guest in the name of Utata Umavuso Dogoda, Umvangeli of the Church of God and Saints of Christ. And also the day before that, we had Brother Zolani, who was presenting to us on the previous day when the day before Utata Dogoda, and he also made his particular inputs around this issue. And today we had then opted for, because it's the last day of the commemoration, and I'll be making the presentation. But I want to emphasize that the approach to my presentation is influenced entirely by the intellectuality of my interest in the Bulhoek Massacre, firstly, and secondly, the AmaSirayeli as a church in its entirety, but also thirdly, Enoch Mgijima as a person who engages certain types of messaging. Now, if you are able to join us in this conversation, put across your comments, put across your questions. We will try by all means to answer them in this shortest space of time. Yesterday, Evangelist Dogoda made a critique against the people, including myself, those who are engaging the Bulhoek Massacre as the central theme of Enoch Mgijima or AmaSirayeli. And I understood that the critique that he was raising against me, and I thought it would be important that we need to address that particular critique. And it was not only against me, but the critique was expanded to other people who look at the Bulhoek Massacre as the predecessor to the Church of God, AmaSirayeli, or to Enoch Mgijima. So from his perspective, it was that the Bulhoek Massacre must be seen within the context of Enoch Mgijima and the church, not that Enoch Mgijima must be seen within the church, within the prism of the Bulhoek Massacre. So the Bulhoek Massacre comes after. And on the basis of that critique, I thought that was a very important thing. It does not only happen with the people in the church, it also happens with the academic world, and it also happens with the analysts of this historical moment. But what is an advantage of the centering the Bulhoek Massacre as the center of conversation is that it provides us with an opportunity to then go back, to move back a little bit, to get to understand who is Enoch Mgijima, what was his messaging, what does his message entail in relation to that particular outlook. And therefore, if you start at the Bulhoek Massacre, it provides us with an opportunity to go back, therefore, and learn and relearn understand and see the messaging of Mgijima, the preaching of Mgijima, the Church of God and Saints of Christ, AmaSirayeli, as they are known, as the central theme of what is it that they were engaging on. So it is wonderful to look at the Bulhoek Massacre commemoration, but don't end there. I think that's what we need to do. Do not end at that particular point. You need to go back a little bit and go and understand as to how to view, understand, and interrogate Mgijima and the church. Now, my title of my talk and the paper that I'm going to be presenting here is fundamentally and mostly academic, and it is a revision of the paper that I presented in the 2021 kwakukho a centennial celebration or centennial commemoration of the Bulhoek Massacre, and it was held in conjunction with the University of Pretoria and also the JIAS of University of Johannesburg, I think. Yes, it was held with that University of Pretoria and University of Johannesburg. Now, this is the revision of my paper, and my paper is going to take various approaches, and some of the themes that I'm going to be presenting and be talking about is the question of what will be my approach. Can we trust history as a learning, as a study of the past? And then we look at the aspect of the missionary enterprise and how these missionary enterprise and their interactions with the Africans in the Cape Colony, that is in the Cape. And we look at the relationship between the conquerors and the conquered, now the missionaries and the colonialists, and the Africans as the conquered in the Cape. We also look at Enoch Mgijima, the Bulhoek Massacre, and also the social milieu, the type of an environment with which Enoch Mgijima was coming out of, the type of environment with which the Bulhoek Massacre happened at. And then we look at another theme that is talking about how did these Africans, because at that time there were Africans who then contested the construction of being seen as the other. You will see how these Africans are then establishing these so-called African independent churches. And after that, I will talk to the theme that was spoken about by Brother Zolani Masoleng, who had presented on Tuesday when he was talking about the reimagination of God. And our principle on this particular point will be talking about the reimagining of the imagination of the aspect of God. And then we will talk about considering Mgijima, what we talk about the land as an existential question. You'll remember yesterday Umfangelu Dogoda was speaking about the self-determination of the church, and he did make, and he alluded to a particular point about the importance of the land. And then I would like to maybe, if time permits, I will talk about the theme that speaks around the issue of remember not to forget, a comparative analysis between freedom and liberation, because these two, for me, in my understanding, they are different. Liberation is something different to freedom, and therefore on the basis of that, if time permits, we are going to be looking at that particular point. Let us proceed. The killing and injuring of and arresting of hundreds of AmaSirayeli who were black worshippers in Ntabelanga on the 24th of May 1921 by the Union of South Africa Colonial Police and Soldiers has been analyzed, commemorated, and historicized in various ways. Most importantly, in the universities or in the academic world, this killing, which came to be known in South African historiography as the Bulhoek Massacre, has been a subject of many scholars, has been a subject of research of many scholars from various disciplines. As I have said to you, that there has been this particular interest and this growth in this, in the looking at this this particular Bulhoek Massacre project. One of those people who had a great interest is Martin Mandieu. Martin Mandieu is one of the people who has a great interest in the Bulhoek Massacre. In his doctoral thesis titled War, Memory and Salvation, the Bulhoek Massacre, and the construction of a contextual soteriology, which was published in 1997 at the University of KZN, provides us with one of the ways of looking at the Bulhoek Massacre outside of the historicity, outside of the political, and outside of the socio political relations. But also there is also somebody who is of great interest in this field of study of the Bulhoek Massacre. We've got Reverend Ngwanya. Reverend Ngwanya has done an ecclesiological analysis of the Church of God and Saints of Christ and the impacts of the Bulhoek Massacre. Now, if you look at those particular two approaches, both of them, they do not focus on the socio-political, but they form part of. Their focus is the scholars, the study revolves around the fact that they were done by theologians, and therefore the focus is mainly at a theological level. However, there are other people who have engaged Enoch Mgijima, Bulhoek Massacre, and AmaSirayeli from an outside of a theological perspective, which is something that I do as well. I'm outside of the theological perspective or theological inquiry, but I do interrogate some theological elements of Enoch Mgijima, the church, AmaSirayeli, and other things. So there are other scholars as well who have analyzed Enoch Mgijima and the massacre using other tools. For instance, you've got in Mokobe's dissertation, who has on one hand interrogated the massacre from a military perspective. And also you've got John Millard, who also published the work in 1997, and Robert Edgar, who has published extensively on the subject and has used, both of them, Millard and Robert Edgar have used historical lenses to the particular subject. So the subject itself is huge, it is complex, it is great, and therefore sometimes a critic around a particular output or a particular forms of analysis is not necessarily an acceptable or justifiable critic, because the study, the massacre itself, the AmaSirayeli, Enoch Mgijima as well, these three elements, they present something that is very much complex. So most recently, with the re-emergence of the debate of land expropriation without compensation in democratic South Africa, you have seen people like Sam Mataise, who had written something in 2015 and had analyzed the Bulhoek Massacre within the recent political developments. So by 2015, there was this rise of especially the emergence of the EFF, and this it's political rhetoric around the issue of expropriation of land without compensation. And Sam Mataise had analyzed the massacre within that particular context, and his work, which was titled "The Significance of the Bulhoek Massacre Today," was somewhat a critique on the way that government has handled the historical and emotive issue of the dispossession of the African people and their lands. And he fundamentally engages the Bulhoek Massacre with the help of the tools acquired in the discipline of political sciences. You will remember I said earlier, there are people who use the theological orientation, there are people who are using a historical analysis, there are people who are using the political sciences lenses to interrogate the Bulhoek Massacre, because Bulhoek Massacre is complex, it's big, and it is huge at an academic level. Now, all these scholars who have engaged this particular topic and that I have mentioned above, in this paper is developed within the academy, and it seeks to engage the very topic, but it wants to use it a little bit differently. I'm using an intellectual approach to talk to this particular issue. Even though the things that Umvangel Dogoda has spoken about, even the things that Brother Zolan Masoleng has spoken about, even the things that I spoke about at the opening of this series, we will be engaging them here. But now the difference is that we will be using an intellectual approach, an intellectual analysis, and also we will be criticizing certain elements, but also applying some philosophical underpinnings on the entirety of the conversation. And the intention is to combine various disciplinary tools in the quest to re-engage Enoch Mgijima AmaSirayeli, and the Bulhoek Massacre. That is the idea why I do this particular work. Now, though my presentation is interested in the historical moment, which is the Bulhoek Massacre moment, though my presentation is interested in that, and that it will depart from that historical context, but I will employ and borrow limitedly from anthropology, theology, extensively from philosophy and political sciences. Now, the thesis of this essay is that Enoch Mgijima and AmaSirayeli were suffocated by the colonial metrics of power, and it pursued and it wanted to impose a state of this is my thesis. Let me put it correctly. Enoch Mgijima and AmaSirayeli were suffocated by the colonial metrics of power. These colonial metrics of power wanted to impose a state of spiritual, psychological, physical, social, and sociological death on the Africanness of AmaSirayeli, on the Africanness of Mgijima, on the Africanness of the people around Mgijima and Black people in general. Now, as a way of delegitimizing the African people, the colonial metrics of power, which is the imperialist colonialist regime of the Union of South Africa, it portrayed AmaSirayeli as an ignorant mob of followers, helpless and helpless, irrational lunatics. It looked at them as an irrational group of people, helpless lunatics who were barbaric objects, who had no particular existence, and therefore that they did not deserve any human recognition. So what the colonial government did about Mgijima, and what it did about African people, and what it did about Black people in particular at the time, it created an impression to people that Enoch Mgijima and his followers were a mob of irrational beings. They were lunatics. They were they were people who cannot even recognize the ability to be human. They could not even reason as a group or as an individual. Now, the combination of being materially exploited, politically oppressed, spiritually strangulated, and humanly disregarded formulated the pattern with which AmaSirayeli would begin their quest, their understanding, or their pathway towards finding themselves. So these people were oppressed. These people were placed in the periphery. These people were seen as lunatics, irrational lunatics, objects that are barbaric, people who do not have even an ability to think for themselves. And all of these things, when Enoch Mgijima and AmaSirayeli began to look at these things because they were able to think, when they began to view these things because they were able to see, when they began to understand this oppression that was taking place within them, within their environment, they were able to they were able to create a path or develop something that would then say to them, you know what, we need to go and find ourselves. We need to look back. We need to go back and find ourselves as a people, as a persons, and we must not allow ourselves to be perceived as a group of people who are unable to reason, think, define, and determine what it means to be human. What it means to be human. So that particular outlook, that combination of things, which at some point some are spiritual, some are socio-political, some are historical, and they were the result. They caused the situation with which AmaSirayeli would then find themselves in, and sometimes to therefore want to use one particular lens of understanding the Bulhoek Massacre, Enoch Mgijima, and AmaSirayeli in their entirety. It would limit us because we are then unable to look at the complexity of what made Mgijima, what made AmaSirayeli, what resulted in the Bulhoek Massacre of 24 May 2021. Now, I therefore say this is the combination. This is the combination of things that created this, and this is the combination that created the path for AmaSirayeli and Mgijima to go and want to reconnect with one's humanity. Now, the reconnection that I'm referring to, its intention was to recapture salvation. I'll talk about salvation at a later stage, and also to recapture liberation and liberate themselves simultaneously. So there was a process of doing two things at the same time with Mgijima, and this is what I'm presenting now. During the centuries preceding that of the Bulhoek Massacre, the advent of Enoch Mgijima, the Church of God and Saints of Christ AmaSirayeli in the Cape Colony, European Christianity had colonized what is called liberation. It has also colonized what is understood as salvation. So both of these concepts that I'm talking about were colonized by European Christianity. And you would understand that I'm talking about European Christianity I'm sorry for that slight technical glitch. You must understand that we are experiencing different time zones of load shedding and electricity blackouts. So at times, electricity will then disturb us. But let me quickly continue with that. And as I was saying that at the time, because of this European Christianity and its approach, it therefore it universalized and colonized salvation and colonized liberation. And during those periods, this European universalism, with the help of the missionaries, had created this, what I called earlier, a colonial matrix of power that strangled indigenous people, African people, not only in the Cape Colony at the period, but in other colonized territories as well. Now, if you look at the entirety of that particular environment, you would then realize that European missionaries were influencing how things must be defined, determined, and how they must be done. For an example, I am in one of the historical schools that was established by missionaries, but also used as a basis for black students. You see, so there was this. When you come into this particular institution, you are then directed as to what does it mean what is salvation, how to define it, and how to get it, and what is liberation. So there was this contestation even before the coming of Enoch Mgijima and AmaSirayeli, and there was the resistance to the universalism and European modernity, which Mgijima and AmaSirayeli ended up resulting in what we would refer to as the 200 young, middle-aged, and old African men being physically injured, being murdered, being killed, being buried in a shallow grave on the 24th of May, 1921. Now, the resistance to universalism and European modernity by Mgijima resulted in over 200 young men, middle-aged men, old African men, physically killed by a Maxim machine gun and rifles that were fitted with bayonets. Now, the dead, I'm saying the dead, it's actually supposed to be the killed, were buried in 2 shallow mass graves at Ntabelanga to maintain European imperialist, colonialist, and racist contours and ideas. Now, the mass graves have become a post-apartheid government, that is the ANC government-sponsored spectacle, as we have seen, or as we had witnessed during the centennial commemoration held on 21 May 2021. And this particular point of a spectacle was referred to by Mvangelu Dogota yesterday when he was talking about it, this particular issue of a Bulhoek Massacre. Now, while for populist politicians, the graves are a site of spectacle, as I have already alluded, but for the remnants of the murdered AmaSirayeli and the victims of the AmaSirayeli, I want to argue that the mass graves have been characterized as a sacred shrine. AmaSirayeli, ever since I grew up, AmaSirayeli look at that particular graves as some form of a apamatambo oba umkhulu balele khona. So it is a sacred shrine for AmaSirayeli. And I said with the politicians, it is a site of spectacle. Though this is the case between AmaSirayeli and the politicians, but the decolonial impetus in me, the decolonial impetus that influences my reading of history, my writing of African history, my analysis of African history, it necessitates me to implore that the reader and the hearer, the perceiver of my talk at this particular point, it must be understood within the point of the sacred shrine or the site of spectacle. It must never be looked only as that, but it must be seen as a combat zone. The site with which AmaSirayeli were buried on the 24th of May 1921, it must be understood as a combat zone, an unjust combat zone, not just an ordinary combat zone, but an unjust combat zone for the killing, for the annihilation of the indigenous people who were burdened with the need to relieve themselves from this modernity of salvation that was colonized by the Europeans. from this colonized modernity of liberation. Now, my paper basically, when you have the time to read it, when you have the time to look at it, it has a particular approach. Of importance and to note in this paper is that it has carefully included salvation in inverted commas and liberation in inverted commas in its title, as you have heard earlier, that I'm talking about the salvation and the liberation in relation to the Bulhoek Massacre and AmaSirayeli. Now, the purpose is to reflect the distinct but the interrelated nature of these two concepts. Because as we understand, in the African cosmology, an individual is made up of two principles, if I were to say, with a lack of a better word. It is made up of the soul and it is made up of the physical aspect. And on top of that, I want to adopt Boff's argument. There is Boffs and Boffs. They have made an argument that also a human being is constituted of two concrete principles, the soul and the body. Now, these faculties where belief and action are located. So from the soul, there is from the soul and the body, these two principles, they are distinct, but they are interrelated. They are distinct in this way. One is not the same as the other, but the other cannot function without the other. So both of them, they operate in the same realm, but they are different to each other, but they cannot operate one without the other. Now, the faculties, which is the soul and the body, it is where the belief and action is located. For an example, if you believe in something, if you believe that you are going to achieve or to get salvation, you need to believe in it. And for you to be able to do that, the soul provides you with that particular approach. But the body then drives you to a particular way of achieving or going to attain that particular salvation. So these particular two faculties, it's where the belief and the action, they stay together. And it is for this reason that I do not like to locate only the Mgijima understanding from a spiritual aspect without the material relations of or the material conditions of the environment with which they were engaging on. Now, Boff provides us with a great approach of how to deal with this two concepts, two principles, and he calls it an anthropological model. And this anthropological model is excuse me, it is something that is concerns with the questions of salvation and liberation, which have led him to develop these other four models, which we're not going to talk about them extensively. The first one I already said is anthropological. The other one is sacramental. The other one is agapic model, and the other one is the Chalcedonian model. But my interest is on the anthropological model, which deals with the soul and the body. Now, that is how we begin to understand the Bulhoek Massacre, Enoch Mgijima, and AmaSirayeli. We understand them from an anthropological model as articulated by Boff, because it has these two distinct but interrelated. The problem with the other ones, the Chalcedonian one, conjoins salvation and liberation, but it concludes that salvation is intrinsically included in the liberation. And the agapic one, it distinguishes between salvation and liberation. And the other one, which is not also my interest, does not put and work these two concepts together. So therefore, the person who's listening to me, in whatever that I'll be talking about, I want you to listen to me on the basis of these anthropological models as developed by Boffs and Boffs, which puts salvation and the soul and the body intrinsically different but interrelated. Secondly, when I'm presenting the paper, if you will have the time to read it, I will show what is the colonial matrix of power, and I will argue that it comprises of four interrelated domains. One, the control of the economy, the control of authority, the control of gender and sexuality, and also the control of knowledge, which is one of the things that we contest when we engage in the type of epistemological work that we do in the academy, myself and others included. Now, these domains, these 4 domains, as I will show later in the day, I will demonstrate with them that Mgijima and AmaSirayeli wanted to challenge this matrix of power that was developed, and he broke away. I'm saying broke away in inverted commas. Please, colleagues, understand this. I'm saying he broke away in inverted commas from the confines of European Christian universalism. But instead, the reason why I said he broke away in inverted commas, but instead of his breaking away was that he breaks away by combining um, African traditional religion, Christianity, and Hebrew Judaic models of religiosity. Now, this is an important approach to analyze the Bulhoek historical moment. For me, it is an important thing because, as I said earlier, it's a complex output. Therefore, when you analyze it, you need to analyze it on the basis of its complexity. It had 4 different dimensions, and you need to use 4 different dimensions as well to engage it, because Eurocentric paradigm of knowing tends to want to locate things in oneness. For an example, I've got a problem of this. There is only one God. There is only one Once again, we are apologizing for this break in transmission at times, but we will try and keep up with this conversation. But we are really experiencing some difficulties. I was going to talk about can history be trusted? Can the study of the past, can the study of the past be trusted? And I want to answer this question in this way. For over a number of years, the history of Enoch Mgijima, AmaSirayeli, and the moment of the Bulhoek Massacre has been the source of historiographical interest, both in the university, that is in the academy, and in the public collective memory. Various narratives by AmaSirayeli and also the researchers have been presented of the history of Mgijima and his followers. Due to different history narratives, some remain confused as to how to remember Enoch Mgijima. Some they end up not remembering him, as the point was presented yesterday by Umvangeli Udokot. Now, this does not only raise a concern about Mgijima as an individual, but it also raises a concern as to inquire whether history can be trusted. A staggering notion was suggested by the historian John Arnold that history is the mother of truth, or is the mother truth, because it can be defined as true stories, close quote. Now, true in a sense that it should be in agreement with the evidence of the past. But in contrast to this particular view that Arnold puts across, that history is the mother truth, because what makes it is because the stories of the past are true, and then it uses and it utilizes the evidence developed from the past to make those truths. There are people who contested that view. For instance, Professor Mogobe Ramose, a professor of jurisprudence, or professor of philosophy, if I were to say, in the Department of Jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria, he contends that history must always be received with some skepticism because of its blindness. He says, fascinatingly, I quote, fascinatingly, historians can produce authoritative facts about history, even though they were not present at the time of the incident that happened in the past. Now, he says their non-presence at the time of the historical event is the blindness, and it is the blindness which he refers to. Now, John Muller, a professor of political sciences, raises a similar concern about history. And he says in his work, and he says in the work of historians, that most of what we believe about history and the past depends on the narratives and the narrative sources that were decorated by circumstances, including individual point of views. For an example, some people understand Enoch Mgijima, AmaSirayeli, and the Church of God and Saints of Christ within a particular dimension. There are other people who understand it within a particular dimension. But both of these groups of people, they are talking about the same historical past. And it is for this reason that Arnold is talking, Muller is raising this particular issue of narrative sources and circumstances and individual point of views. For instance, myself, I'm developing a point of view with you, and somebody at the end of the day we will write a historicity and a historical paper on the very same subject based on our opinions, and therefore that can influence somebody else who reads Enoch Mgijima, who research Enoch Mgijima, and who researches the Bulhoek Massacre as well. So you need to understand this particular point. But for Muller, this reveals the problems of history, because it is not only Muller's identification. I also identify it, because these are the problems of history. But however, we need to overcome these problems. And Muller proposes that, I quote, history should be recognized as often speculative and incomplete interpretation of the time gone by, and the places we can no longer for sure go to and know, close quote. So we need to understand history from that. Speculative in nature, even though it relies on evidence of the past, but we need to understand some elements of it. But also at the same time, about places that we can no longer know for sure. We can see buildings, we can see structures, we can determine some of the things and say, this is how things were. but we need to understand there are its history's limitations. Now, true that history should be considered as such in the process of its own consideration. Ramose skepticism must be held in high esteem on the basis that, honestly, history is fundamentally his or her story, not entirely our story. History as presented in these days. Now, the notion presented by Arnold on the truth of history is very problematic, as you have probably might have realized now, on the basis that sources of the past have either been both singular and biased, or were carefully selected for a specific objective. For instance, when you go into the archives of this country, dominantly you will find things that majority of AmaSirayeli, the family of Mgijima, and most people who read now, when they read and research on the historical developments of AmaSirayeli and Mgijima, you will find things that they disagree with, because even the sources themselves were developed and selected for a specific objectives. Now, as researchers and as people who read on these things, as people who study these works, it is important to treat all historical work critically. We need to be self-conscious about also our own work that we do as researchers at the same time. So while there exist these problems of history, you see, now I've spoken about the problems of history and historical work, but we look at Dr. John Henry Clark, who transitioned in 1998, who was a professor of history, and he speaks about history in this way, I quote, "History is not everything, but it is a launching pad and a clock that people use to tell their time of day." He further says it can be used as a compass for people to find themselves on the map of human geography, since history tells them, the people, where they are, but more importantly, what they must be, what the type of people they should be, and close quote. Now, also in defense of history and in partial agreement with Professor Henry Clark, is one of the greatest sons of the soil, Samuel Edward Unkruneka Mqhayi, who died in 1945, who was referred to as Imbongi Yesizwe yaseNtabelanga. And he postulates about history, and I quote, "A proper understanding of your history is moreover the key correct political strategy, for there is no political leader that will be able to defend any African rights and African people if they are ignorant of their history," close quote. Now, ngamazwi avakalayo, uMqhayi says to us, naliphi na iciko, nesiphi na isithethi, naliphi na ikhalipha esizweni salo, lithi ukuze lime kakuhle kwinto eliyikholelwayo nento elikuyo, lime ngolwazi lwembali. Ngokuthetha into eliyaziyo, ungama njani, uyabuza uMqhayi, ungama njani ungenalwazi lwezinto zakokwenu? Now, you look at this and you see that there is this skepticism, but also there is this need for this looking at history as an important element. While there exist these concerns raised by Miller, Ramose, but Mqhayi and Clark grants us the justification for the consideration or for the considering and partially trusting history through, as though as intellectuals we are faced with various historical dilemmas. Now, before the emergence of Enoch Mgijima, the Europeans came and the missionaries came into South Africa, especially in the Cape Colony, and there was an interaction between the two societies or the two characteristics, people from the missionary group and people from the indigenous. Now, my next point is I want to speak about that particular interaction, because it is important as a foundation of how does Mgijima ends up the way he is. Why do we have, at the end of the day, the Bulhoek Massacre? Now, this part of the talk speaks about the missionary enterprise and their interactions with Africans in the Cape. We call these people, these missionaries enterprise, as the Salvation Army. Now, in the later part of the 17th century, European settlers through the Dutch East Indian Company persuaded slaves and European Christian, persuaded slaves to European Christian prayers, and they were paying them with alcohol and tobacco. So they would give them alcohol and tobacco to ensure that they those who mastered the European Christian prayers, they would be given some incentive of alcohol and tobacco. This does not imply that European Christianity arrived with the Dutch East Indian Company in the Cape. Please, I'm using this as a springboard for how the interaction between the indigenous, including the slaves themselves who were brought in by these European settlers. There is, however, an existing evidence that the indigenous people in the Cape were already exposed to this form of Christianity way before the arrival of the European settlers in the Cape. For instance, by the time the Moravians arrived, which was the first Pentecostal group to arrive in the Cape during 1732, indigenous people had some form of a theology that they had. I'm using theology because I don't have a proper word to refer to their way of life for the purposes of this paper. It could be that they had their own traditions, if one were to say, and their grasp of how to grasp Christianity. And now I'm no longer saying European Christianity, I'm saying Christianity in general. They had their own theology, they had their own way of how to grasp the Christianity as well. Even prior to the arrival of the 1820 settlers, which gave rise to the activities of the Methodist missionary activities in the Cape, there were confrontations and interactions between Africans with their culture and the missionaries as the colonialists. Now, this period also, as I said earlier, speaks about this particular resistance that is taking place between these two people, or these two attitudes, these two people who come from different societies. These resulted in what came to be known as the cattle killing movement that lasted for over a year between 1856 and 1857. That means now that springing of the Methodist missionary activities and this rise of Pentecostal Christianity in the Cape Colony, it resulted in this issue of Nongqawuse and the killing of Inkomo in 1856 and 1857. Now, the indigenous Xhosa people in the Cape frontier had before that tried without success to resist the colonialists and their worldview and how they see modernity and European culture. Now, this European culture is described, therefore, by these people who read and who study this as a conversion of indigenous people to take part in this new way of living. Now, this type of way of living, which comes with the Europeans, it wanted to rationalize itself as modern and civilized. And it also created a situation where the Africans were seen as barbaric, irrational, and therefore they need to be civilized. Now, because of this adoption or of this rise of this new modernity, of this new hegemony that is brought in by the Europeans, there was a decline in a traditional institutions, the destruction of African political entities, and by the end of the 19th century, there was a steady rooting of European Christianity in the Cape. And this took root amongst the indigenous people, even though they were still contesting, even though they were still resisting this particular way of life. So by the end of that period, those who had converted, therefore, remember I said Christianity was then rooted. By the end of the century, the end of that particular period, there were those who had converted to European Christianity, and they were at times educated in the missionary education schools, like the Hilltown schools, like many other missionary established schools. And there was therefore a rise of what one would refer to as I just want to ensure that I refer to it. I refer to it properly. There was a rise of those who were educated in missionary schools and those who had then because educated, converted to European Christianity, it was something that was similarly one and the same thing, if I were to say. And this group was therefore regarded as amaqoboka, and those who had not converted, and most of them who had not been educated, were referred to amaqaba. So amaqaba is abantu ababomvu, that is the red people. Amaqaba were those who continued to smear their red ochre on their face. Hence, they were referred to as the red people. And they were opposed to these new ways of understanding, and they had opted to hold on to their old ways against the amaqoboka. So you then have the European understanding creates the dichotomy between these African people. These African people are Africans, but you then have amaqaba, and then you have amaqoboka. And this is therefore the terminology that is then defines primarily and influences those who have accepted European Christianity and those who had rejected it. But unfortunately, even though people had then been accepted into the conversion of the Christian faith, the European Christian faith, they were troubled at the same time by the problem that even though they are converted into Christianity, they are not recognized as fully human beings. Now, amaqoboka then were troubled by the feeling of their vilified past. Some researchers argue that, and therefore they say, hey, you know what? Let us abandon this way of living and adopt modern civilization. You understand? So there was this creation of these two type of people, even though they were both Africans, but these two type of people who are part and parcel of the same society, but now they have two different norms: amaqaba and amaqoboka, the civilized and the uncivilized, the barbaric and the non-barbaric. Now, this situation therefore creates what Uchidesta argues, that these included now the ways of living of amaqoboka. They included that you must accept Christ, you must acknowledge your sin, you must you must know that you are going to get forgiveness, and that there must be individual sanctification. These, all of them, they resulted in a lot of practices of European Christianity. When do you go to church? What happens in the church? And how do you do that in the church? And all of these things. And